I thought today would be a perfect day to talk about today's topic. Why do Jews reject Christianity? So let's start with the question. Do Jews reject Christianity? Okay, we need a little... The Jews reject Christianity. The answer should be a firm yes. But the truth of the matter is, a recent poll, a survey done, the 2013 Pew Research study, asked in their survey question, is believing that Jesus was the Messiah compatible with Judaism? And they took a poll of Jews. And shockingly, more than 1/3 of Jewish Americans said it's possible and it is compatible to believe that Jesus was the Messiah and to be Jewish at the same time, and it's compatible with Judaism. And that's a bit of an alarming statistic, to me at least. Yeah, maybe let's hold the questions just for a few moments. And maybe till natural breaking points. Today, I'd like to go over 5 pieces of information, maybe 5 parts to our discussion today. We'll get you out of here by 2 p.m. We'll talk about why historically, the truth of the matter is most Jews, it's interesting, most Jews today are not particularly observant. Jews in the United States of America. An overwhelming majority of Jews are not observant. Yet, one gets the sense that even the most unobservant Jews, if you'd say, well, what is Judaism? Now, maybe they might not articulate it with these words, but for many, many Jews in the United States, all Judaism is it's not Christianity. For many Jews, their Judaism means, I don't know what it is on a positive sense, but I can tell you what it isn't. It isn't Christianity. Most Jews, many Jews, a good chunk of at least, the other 2/3 of Jews probably are not celebrating Christmas today. And what we'd like to discuss today is maybe 5 pieces, 5 little compartments. Number 1, historically, why have Jews, maybe from a historical perspective, why have Jews rejected Christianity? Number 2, we'll then look at Judaism, why Judaism rejects Christ, the notion that Jesus was the Christ. We'll then talk, number 3, why Judaism rejects Christianity as a religion. Number 4, we'll try to address, time permitting, what about the fact of all the things that Jesus did? How can they reject all of that? And then number 5, we'll take a closer look and explain how can Judaism reject the claims that many Christian theologians have made that the Torah itself, that Tanakh, our sacred text, clearly identifies Jesus as the Messiah. So those are going to be our 5 goals for today's class. If one takes a look, even in the New Testament, which you don't need to have a copy of, and I don't recommend getting, but I happen to have one over here. If you look at Matthew 23, it's not on your source sheets, but Matthew 23, verse 1. Then Jesus said to his crowds and his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees are were the rabbis, the time of Jesus. This was the Orthodox Jewish community. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything that they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. Jesus is accusing the rabbis of his day of hypocrisy. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Calling out the rabbis. Everything they do is done for men to see. They make their phylacteries, their tefillin. They make their tefillin wide and their tassels, their tzitzis on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogue. They love to be greeted in the marketplace and to have men call them rabbi. So Matthew in chapter 23, which is a vitriolic polemic against the Jewish leadership of his time, is calling the rabbis and the leaders of the Jewish people hypocrites. He's calling them people who are just seeking glory and people who are not interested in anything that's actually spiritual. And that's, chapter 23 in Matthew just goes on and on. Really, speaking very negatively, calling the rabbis and leaders of the Jewish people vipers and serpents. Historically, if you want to know why Jews don't really love Christianity so much, well, that's a good place to start. And the New Testament itself is particularly Matthew, is pretty antagonistic towards Judaism and the leadership of Judaism. Well, that's not going to make us feel warm and cozy towards Christianity. And that really, from its very onset, has distanced the Jewish community from Christianity. But the truth of the matter is, if we ask historically why Jews have rejected Christianity, without even getting to theological and arguments, which we'll get to shortly, there's one answer: anti-Semitism. The history of the church and the history of the Jewish-Christian relationship has been a history of persecution, a history of torture, a history of anti-Semitism. Now, don't be fooled and look today and you see in many groups, different Christian groups, they seem to love the Jews, they love Israel, and they're pro-Jewish and pro-Israel. Don't be fooled by that, because although we appreciate, we'll take friends wherever we get them, don't get me wrong, that does not represent the overwhelming majority of history. For the last 2,000 years, that has not been the case. That is a very, very, very new movement. The fact that Christians really beginning after World War II, really in the 60s and 70s, have different groups and denominations have come to embrace or claim that they love Jews or appreciate Israel, that's a very, very new thing. But historically, Jews have been persecuted, tortured, killed, and been mistreated by Christians. So if you want to know historically why Jews have rejected Christianity, you don't even need a theological argument. It's the fact that we have a very, very tough and tortured and strained past in history. So for example, you can look at the early church fathers. Jerome: my enemies are the Jews. They have conspired in hatred against me, crucified me, heaped evils of all kinds upon me, blasphemed me. Constantine splintered Christianity and Judaism. Augustine: these are the earliest of the church fathers. And this is not in your sources. These are in my notes. St. Augustine, he was the one who came up with the doctrine of the Jewish witness. He believed the Jewish people would be converted to Christianity at the end of times, and argued that God had not allowed them to survive their dispersion as a warning to the Christians. We have history. You talk about the story of the Jewish experience during the times of the Crusaders, 1096, the Rhineland massacres. Those were all initiated directly by the church and carried out by very pious Christians. We have prayers that we recite till today. We recite it every Shabbos, Avarachamim. It's a prayer for those martyred by the Crusaders who were, acting on behalf of Christianity. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 required that Jews wear something distinguishing them as Jews. You think the Nazis were the ones who came up with that? Oh no, it goes back to 1215. And the list will go on and on. Blood libels, the expulsion. We know the expelled Jews were expelled from Spain. Jews were kicked out of England for several hundred years. Jews have been persecuted. And one of my favorites, okay, that's the Catholic Church. But if you even look at the Protestant church, Protestant denomination, let's look at Martin Luther. He wrote a charming little pamphlet called On the Jews and Their Lies, where he talks about the Jews being venomous beasts, vipers, disgusting scum, candors, devils incarnate. Their private houses must be destroyed and devastated. They could be lodged in stables. Let the magistrates burn their synagogues, and let whatever escapes be covered with sand and mud. Let them be forced to work, and if this avails nothing, we will be compelled to expel them like dogs in order not to expose ourselves to the incurring divine wrath and eternal damnation from the Jews and their lies. You want to know where Hitler got his anti-Semitism? You just have to go back, only a few centuries in his own Germany. And if you want to know why Jews have not had a wonderful relationship with Christianity and why Jews historically have rejected Christianity, well, that's a good place to start. It's not been a very fun experience living in Christian lands. And as a general rule, again, we live in mostly a Christian country here today, and things are, relatively speaking, good for the Jewish people. This is the exception. The history of the Jewish people in Christian countries has been a history of persecution, torture, and destruction. So that's why Jews historically don't love Christianity. But let's now talk from a theological perspective, from a religious perspective. Can Jews believe in the Christ? So let's take a step back. What does the word Christ mean? Very good. Christ means Messiah. It is the Greek word. I believe it's the Greek word Christos. It's the word for Messiah. New question. What does the word Messiah mean?
Messenger.
Okay, very good. So everyone take your look at your source sheets. In source 1, this is the story of when Shmuel Hanavi Samuel finds the first of, not the first king, but really the second king of the Jewish people, King David. And he sends forth, and he brought him, and he was red-headed, and he had beautiful eyes, and he was handsome. Vayomer Hashem, and God said, "Come, arise." He's talking to Samuel. Arise, mishachehu, anoint him, kizehu, for he is him. So what does that mean? Anoint him. What does anointing mean? Vayikach Shmuel, verse 13. Vayikach Shmuel's Karen Hashemen, and Shmuel took literally the horn of oil. It means a jug of oil. They used to carry oil inside hollowed horns. Vayimoshach oso, and he anointed him b'kerev echav, amongst his brothers. Tislach Hashem al David, and the Spirit of God was successful. It passed over David Mayomahu Maila on that day onward. Mashiach, the literal word Mashiach, Messiah is an English translation of the word Mashiach. Mashiach means to anoint. Anoint is a verb. It's to pour oil over something. The truth is, you could pour oil not just over people, but over things. For those of you who were celebrated Hanukkah and you came to Shul on the 8th day of Hanukkah, we had a special Torah reading on the 8th day of Hanukkah. If you look in source 2, Vayhi b'yom kalos. No, sorry. This is the first day of Hanukkah. This is the Torah reading from the first day of Hanukkah. It says, Vayhi b'yom kalos Moshe lahakim es mishkan. And behold, it was on the day that Moses erected, he built the Mishkan, Vayimoshach oso. He anointed the tabernacle, the Mishkan. Vayikadosh oso v'skol kelev. He anointed the Mishkan and all its articles. When you would consecrate something, in Judaism, to consecrate a king, or to consecrate the Beis Hamikdash, the Mishkan, the temple, the way it was consecrated was by taking a special form of oil, and you would pour it over the top of that person or item. And that's what made it, that's what gave it the moment where it now becomes sanctified. A king has different laws than regular people, has different mitzvahs. At what point does a king actually have the status of a king? It's when that oil requires that oil to be poured on top of him. That's what the word Mashiach means. Mashiach means anointed. And King David, was anointed as the king. Well, fast forward to the end of the first temple era. Of course, we know the temple is destroyed. Then we had this rebuilding of the second temple. That was destroyed. We no longer have a monarchy. Judaism is supposed to have a melech, a king. And the king has a lot of requirements and is certainly in a position of leadership and influence amongst the Jewish people. Well, we haven't had a king in thousands of years, which means a big part of the Jewish experience, a lot of the mitzvahs, are no longer observable. When we say Christ, the Christ from a Greek perspective means Mashiach, that they believe that Jesus was the anointed one. He is the Messiah. He is the Messiah. And so I guess we want to explore and ask ourselves, in Judaism, is it possible to accept that Jesus was the Messiah? Because in Judaism we believed, it's one of the 13 principles of Jewish faith, that we believe although the temples have been destroyed and there is no monarchy that's active in the Jewish people, we have a tradition, we believe firmly, and we pray for it 3 times a day. We pray that God restores the Davidic dynasty. We pray, God, please restore the Davidic dynasty. What will happen when that Davidic dynasty is restored? We will now have a new melech, we will have a king, and he will lead the Jewish people. When is that going to happen? In messianic times. Messianic just means we are going to have a new king who we plan on anointing with that oil, and he will now lead the Jewish people. That's the Yemos HaMashiach. That's the Mashiach. That's the Messianic times. The question is, how do I apply for that job? I would like to be the Messiah, the Mashiach. Well, how are you going to get the job description? Is there a job description for the Messiah? If I claim I am the Messiah, is there a way of proving or disproving that? So of course, the answer in Judaism is, we are notorious, we're blessed, we have everything written down. We got laws and books and the Talmud and the Rambam and codes of laws everywhere. And of course, just like we have codes of law and all sorts of lists and rules and do's and don'ts on how to observe Shabbos, how to observe kosher, how to observe everything, well, guess what? The Rambam, who codified, Rabbi Moshe Maimonides, who codified Jewish law gleaned from the Talmud, he just recodified everything. Well, he gives us the description of what it means to be the Mashiach. How do you know someone could potentially be the Mashiach? And if you look in source 3, we're not going to go through all of source 3, but this is in Hilchos Malachim U'Milchamos in chapter 11. He goes through what the Mashiach, what this future king, who we have a tradition is coming back, what are his qualifications? How do we know someone is potentially the Messiah? So if you look in paragraph 4, let's go. Let's actually look at in paragraph 3. One should not presume that the Messianic king must work miracles and wonders, bring about new phenomena in the world, resurrect the dead, or perform other similar deeds. This is definitely not true. Proof can be brought from the fact that Rabbi Akiva, one of the great sages of the Mishnah, was one of the supporters of King Bar Koziva. If you remember the story of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kokhba was going to be the Mashiach. This is basically the generation right after the destruction of the second temple. Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kokhba was potentially the Messiah. Bar Kokhba didn't do any miracles. He and all the sages of his generation considered him to be the Messianic king until he was killed because of his sins. Once he was killed, they realized he was not the Mashiach. The sages did not ask him for any signs or wonders. That was not part of the job description. Paragraph 4, if a king will arise from the house of David, or if a person will arise from the house of David. So job description to be the Messiah. Number 1, you have to be from the house of David. What does that mean? A direct descendant from the house of David. Okay? Who will diligently contemplates the Torah. So this guy's got to be a Torah scholar. And observes its mitzvahs. He observes the mitzvahs. As prescribed by the written law and the oral law, as David his ancestor. And he will compel all of Israel to walk in the way of the Torah. So not only is he observant, but he is going to be a great outreach rabbi. He's going to work for the Kollel and convince everyone to start, observing all the Torah. And rectify the breaches in its observance. And fight the wars of God. So now he becomes a military general. We may with assurance, now here's a key word, this is a good translation, consider him Mashiach. He's possibly the Mashiach. If he fills those things out, now he's a definite maybe. He's a possible candidate for the Mashiach. Okay? If he succeeds in the above, and then he builds the temple in its place, gathers the dispersed of Israel, he is definitely the Mashiach. He will then improve the entire world, motivating all the nations to serve together. It quotes a verse in Sephania. If he did not succeed to this degree, or was killed, he surely is not the Redeemer promised by the Torah. Rather, he should be considered as all the other proper and complete kings of the Davidic dynasty who died. So if you want to know, am I the Mashiach? Am I the Messiah? How do you know that the answer is no? I don't have qualify for any of those things on that job description. I didn't do any of that. Look at the next paragraph. This is the Rambam writes directly about Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth, who aspired to be the Mashiach and was executed by the court, was also alluded to in Daniel's prophecy, as states, the vulgar among your people shall exalt themselves in an attempt to fulfill the verse, and they shall stumble. Can there be a greater stumbling block than Christianity? All the prophets spoke of Mashiach as the Redeemer of Israel and their Savior who would gather their dispersed and strengthen their observance of the mitzvahs. In contrast, Christianity caused the Jews to be slain by the sword, the remnants to be scattered and humbled, the Torah to be altered, and the majority of the world to err and serve God other than the Lord. So if we want to know, does Judaism reject Jesus being the Christ, Jesus being the Messiah? The answer is, we do. Why? He didn't fit the job description. Jesus did not bring the Jews back to observance. Jesus did not rebuild the temple. As a matter of fact, the temple would be destroyed shortly after his death. He simply doesn't fit the job description. Potentially he was related to David. He claimed that if you actually look in the first verse of the New Testament, I think the first one is Luke. First verse in Luke, it gives his ancestry, confusingly, because wasn't he the virgin birth? He didn't have a father. Put that question aside, it lists his father being Joseph, and Joseph being, that's the first verse in the New Testament. It's in there. We'll check it afterwards, right? It identifies his lineage as David. Why? Because they wanted to show, the New Testament wants to make the proof. You see, he could be the Messiah. He fits that part of the job description. The problem is he doesn't fit the rest of the pieces of the job description. So from that perspective, could Jesus have possibly been the Messiah? The answer is definitively no. But what about Christianity as a religion? And here's a confusing piece. And it's important to understand the history a little bit of Christianity. When Christianity first started, Christianity was not a religion. Christianity was a sect of Judaism. This is towards the end of the Second Temple era. What we do know from the end of the Second Temple era, it was a very difficult period of the Jewish people. It was an era where the Jewish people were splintered into many groups, many splintered groups. You had the Sadducees, the Tzaddukim. These were, it's interesting, it's confusing to us today because we tend to think, well, you have observant Jews and different groups that are not observant. The Sadducees were actually fanatically observant, but they did away with the Torah Shebaal Peh. They didn't follow the traditional oral tradition of the Torah, and they had all sorts of different interpretations. They were very fanatic and observant, but just not observing traditional Torah beliefs. The Sadducees. The New Testament makes reference to another group called the Essenes. Again, they had their own way of doing something. They're similar to the Sadducees in the sense that they rejected a lot of the traditional interpretations of the Torah. But again, we should not view them as less devout. They were actually fanatically devout, if anything, more devout than the regular traditional observant Judaism. They lived in near the Dead Sea, the Essenes. In traditional Torah, and like in the Talmud, the Essenes are not really mentioned, maybe backhandedly, but they're not referred to. The New Testament makes a lot of reference to the Essenes. Famously, the Essenes are most known historically as the ones who lived in the Qumran caves. If you remember the Dead Sea Scrolls, those are most likely, we don't know this definitively, but most scholars believe that was a group of Essenes. These were a splinter group during the Second Temple era. You had the Sadducees, the Essenes. You still had some Hellenists left over from the Hanukkah story. You had a big bulk, probably the majority of the Jews were what our sages called Amei Haaretz, which would just mean they were not particular, they were observant, traditional, but they were the regular people of the land, not particularly devout. Probably very, I don't know if this is fully accurate, but probably comparable to most of North American Jewry today. They're not part of this group, they're just secular Jews. They're doing what they're doing, but not particularly involved. You had the Pharisees. Who are the Pharisees? The Pharisees is an English term. It's a kind of a translation of the word Prushim. The Talmud refers to the Prushim. Who are the Prushim? The separatists. Prushim means to separate. The Prushim, the Pharisees, were the ones who maintained the rabbinic tradition, the standard tradition of Judaism as practiced for the thousands of years before then, or centuries before from Sinai, and they saw all these splintered groups within Judaism. And they realized, Judaism had really drifted away, and they separated, as it were, to maintain the tradition of the Jewish people. You had the Zealots, people who, you would call them like nationalists. They were Jewish nationalists. They were the ones that actually lived. You remember the story of the destruction of the Second Temple? They were the ones that actually were the catalysts for the destruction of the Second Temple. You had all these little splinter groups. Now, it should be noted which groups survived. No, before we get that, one other group was the Christian Jews. It's during this time where Christianity moves onto the scene. In its first century, or half century, Christianity was not a religion. It was a group, yet another splinter group of Jews. Jesus was, of course, Jewish. His early followers were all Jewish. And what Christian Jews, what they did, what they were trying to do, what Jesus was trying to teach, was that everyone had got everything wrong. Follow me. We need to clean everything up. We need to clean out the temple. We need to get rid of all the money changers. We need to get rid of all the corruption. And he had his own little sect, right? Eventually, he'd be killed by the Romans. But the original Christian Jews, the original Christianity, was not a new religion. It was part of Judaism. It wouldn't be, confusingly to us, they viewed Jesus as the Mashiach, but within Jewish tradition. He wasn't a deity. It wasn't a new religion. He was simply the Mashiach. Confusingly, it wouldn't be for a few centuries till Jesus was actually deified, turned into a deity, turned into the Trinity, into that, he actually has some kind of godliness to him. That wouldn't be to the year 325, the Nicene Creed, the Council of Nicaea, which right there is I've always found that a little weird. So the early Christians, Jesus himself, never claimed to be any type of deity. It wouldn't be till a bunch of guys in a room who decided that they voted and they decided he's God. Right? That's a little bit of one of the reasons why I'm not so comfortable. Like, who were these people? Based on what authority? If that's not what it was, it's a little bit of a strange thing. So it wouldn't be till the year 325 till Jesus is actually declared a deity. Can we accept that? Can we accept the Nicene Creed that Jesus, part of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, whatever that means, but that Jesus actually embodied some form of the divine? Absolutely not. How do we know? Well, the answer is exactly. There are so many sources, there are so many references in the Torah that make it completely incompatible to accept Christianity as a religion with Judaism. Probably the best way to start, going back to Rambam, who of course articulates the 13 principles of Jewish faith. Again, what those means are, we recited every Shabbos morning, 9:45, at the explanatory service, where everyone should, of course, be, because it's the most amazing service in the world, right? We recite the Yigdal. We read the Yigdal. What is the Yigdal? Yigdal is a poem. Yigdal was a poem which was composed, I don't know when, it's not super clear when Yigdal was composed, but it was composed, it's directly composed based on the 13 principles of Jewish faith as identified by Rambam. Rambam, in his Pirush HaMishnayos, in his commentary on the Mishnah, his introduction to the 10th chapter of the book of Sanhedrin, he identifies what are the 13 principles of Jewish faith. Now, we all know that Judaism has many, many mitzvahs, 613 mitzvahs, and of course there are many subcategories of mitzvahs. And all are important. And if a person rejects one of those mitzvahs, that's a rejection of Judaism. It's all or nothing. We work towards completing all of them, but as a corpus, the entire Torah is one thing. Yet Rambam identifies 13 principles of Jewish faith. What these are to be understood is that, like, it's almost like sequential. If you have a different religion if you get rid of any of the 13 principles of Jewish faith. They are core. They are essential. The 13 principles of Jewish faith. Echad ve'ein yachid ki yichudo. God is one, and there is no oneness like his oneness. Inscrutable and infinite is his oneness. That doesn't sound like the Trinity to me. That there's a Father, a God, a Son, and a Holy God doesn't sound very compatible with the 13. In fact, it isn't. We recite, as a matter of fact, what's probably the most well-known and most sacred verse in all of Judaism, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. That's like the foundation of Judaism, is we believe in our monotheism. Christianity's had a very, very, very difficult time trying to stick that round peg into a square hole to try to tell you, even though we believe in a Trinity, but Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And Judaism looks at that and says, no, that's actually incompatible. There is no notion of the Son of God. That's totally against Jewish thought. Now, Christians themselves struggle mightily and will go through all sorts of acrobatics. I don't mean this I guess I mean it as a polemic, but I don't mean it disrespectfully. I think most Christians don't even know what they mean when they say Trinity. And what they will do is they will say with absolute conviction, they will say, God is three, but he is one, but he is one, but he is three. So if you say, is the Trinity, does that mean there are three gods? They'll say, no, one God. So that means Jesus and the Holy Ghost and the Father are the same thing? No, they're three things, three persons, but one person. They use all these words. I don't mean it disrespectfully. I mean it polemically. Most Christians have no idea what they mean. They don't, it's just because they just heard these words from their pastors and preachers and their bishops and what have you. They probably are well-meaning, but they don't know honestly, I don't think they really understand what that means. If it's three, it's not one. If it's one, it's not three. And Judaism rejects that. Number two, another element within the 13 principles of Jewish faith is we say, Ein lo demos hagof, ein no gof. Lo naroch elav kedushaso. God has no form. God has no image. That's in the Ten Commandments. God has no form, God has no image. So you mean to tell me God appeared in the form of a man? We reject that. And then if you look at source 4 on your sheets, it's going to be Deuteronomy chapter 13. Deuteronomy chapter 13 is probably the most difficult chapter for all of Christianity to deal with. I'll read it in Hebrew, but you'll see the English translation on the bottom. It's called Davar Shanochi Mitzavos Chama Oso Tishmu Lasos. Everything that I this is, this is in Sefer Devarim. All of the things that I command you to do, Lo Sosif Alav Lo Sigra Mimenu. Do not add, nor shall you subtract to it. Now, what Christianity did in the book of Matthew, earlier in like chapter 10 or something like that, right? Jesus proclaims, I am the law. And there is no longer any need to fulfill the law. The Torah says in chapter 13, you can never take away nor add to the Torah. The mitzvahs found, the commandments found in the Torah are immutable. And not only that, but what do you mean? What if a prophet came and said, we're going to change it? The Torah makes it very clear. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams were to arise, and by the way, they provide for you a miracle. And that miracle, that sign, it comes. And he says, everyone should go follow and serve and worship other gods. Do not listen to that prophet. Don't listen to that dreamer. The Torah couldn't have made it possibly clearer. If you believe in the revelation at Sinai, this is the problem that Christianity has. Christianity believes in the Old Testament. They believe in the 5 books of the Torah. They just believe that there's another revelation, and then there's the New Testament. Well, if you're going to accept, it is so incompatible. You don't know why Jews reject Christianity as a religion. If God wrote in the Torah, and let's say theoretically, you are God, and you wanted to communicate in the Torah, I want you to know the mitzvahs are never, ever, ever going away. Number one. And number two, if anyone ever says, by the way, I come in the name of God, and God told me to change the mitzvahs. If God wanted to tell you, never, ever accept that will never, ever change, without exception, you know what he would have done? He would have written Deuteronomy chapter 13. That's what he would have done. It can't be possibly clearer. Now, Christians will say, yes, and despite all that, God changed, Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, and Matthew even says, I have not come to do away with the law, I am the law, and we're just going to change the law. Well, that's exactly what the Torah says you cannot do. Lo yachalif ha'el v'lo yamir daso li'olamim l'zulaso. We read in the Yigdal, in the 13 principles of Jewish faith, Lo yachalif ha'el v'lo yamir daso. God will never change his mind. So if you want to know why Jews reject Christianity as a religion, it's squarely in violation with at least 3 of the core principles of Jewish faith. God is one. God has no form, and God will never change the mitzvahs. That's why Jews reject Christianity as a religion. But then we have to ask ourselves, okay, Rabbi, that's great, but what about the fact that Jesus did all those miracles? He walked on water, he poured the water and turned it into wine, right? When he was washing his hands for Natilat Yadayim, and he turned in at the wedding, and he turned it into wine for all the revelers at the wedding. All the miracles, he healed the sick. What about all those miracles that he did? How do we explain that? How do we explain historical Jesus? I never understood what that term means, but historians, and even, by the way, even Christians and Christian theologians, they differentiate between the biblical Jesus and the historical Jesus, as if to say they acknowledge that Jesus as described by the Gospels is maybe metaphoric, maybe not everything in there happened. So how do we address that? Number one, if those who came to the Jewish Essentials class yesterday, and if you didn't come to yesterday's class, well, guess what? We run the Jewish Essentials class every Wednesday morning. Well, the next 2 weeks, you should come Wednesday morning, 8:30 a.m. for the next 2 more weeks. We've been talking about fundamentals of Jewish ideas. We spoke yesterday about the fact that one of the real weaknesses, right, about Christianity is it turns out, what about all the eyewitnesses? Everything that we know, all the things that Jesus did. Well, if you actually peel that back and look at the story, even internally within Christianity, and we ask, well, what evidence do we have of Jesus' existence? So even following, let's start with one. There are actually going to be 4 main sources. One of those sources is going to be the New Testament. Of course, the New Testament talks about the acts of Jesus. Even internally in the New Testament, the New Testament was not written by people first-hand accounts of Jesus. It's written at least 50 years after the time of Jesus, internally. This is what if you actually read the New Testament, it's stories that were told over to them primarily by Paul, people who then recorded Matthew, Luke, John, and the other guy, I can't remember, I'm sorry. Matthew, Luke, John, and Peter, I think, right? You have in the four Gospels, they are not firsthand accounts of Judaism, of Christianity, of Jesus' acts. It really all turns out, it really all hinges upon, do you believe the account of the story as told over by Paul? So you don't have like a ton of the firsthand evidence that, like, what do you mean? What about all the things that Jesus did? What about all the things? Who said that Jesus did all those things? One guy. That's a very weak link we talked about yesterday. Now, maybe Paul was lying. Maybe Paul was confused. Maybe Paul didn't see accurately. He needed a new set of glasses. Who knows? But all of Christianity really essentially hinges on very few people. So that's data point number one. What about all the stories of Jesus? Well, what about all the stories? What stories of Jesus? What's reported by Paul in the Gospels? Very minimal evidence. Number two, the other source would be the Romans, right? Jesus lived during the Second Temple era. Who was actually in control of Judea at the time were the Romans. The Romans left virtually no historical record of Jesus. Now, isn't that interesting? If Jesus really made that big hoopla during his day, why didn't the Romans record any of that? It's basically none of that's recorded. Another source would be the one historian of the time, the Roman historian at the time, would be Josephus. Who was Josephus? Josephus is a Jewish boy, a Jewish guy, who became turncoat. He joined the other team. He became a Roman, and he became their official historian. And he wrote many historical books, including two books which are accounts of Jewish history: Antiquities of the Jews and Wars and the Jewish Wars. If you look in source 7 in Antiquities, we have Testimonium Flavinium, middle of Josephus. We have the following account. About this time, there lived Jesus. So again, this is not from the New Testament. This isn't from the other Roman sources. This is going to be an account by a Roman historian, a Jewish historian at the time. About this time lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He went over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross. Those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending the third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Well, that's smoking gun evidence, right? Josephus, the historian, talks about Jesus in glowing terms. There's one problem. That was not written by Josephus. This is a clear, all historians will tell you that was a clear interpolation, because, as a matter of fact, the early Christians had a big problem. Here you have the known historian living at the time, and Jesus, of course, made such a big splash, and everyone saw him do all these miracles and do all these wonders and was widely accepted, and everyone recognized him as the Christ, as the Messiah, as the Redeemer. How come none of the Roman historians talked about him? Probably because he wasn't that big of a deal if he existed at all or didn't do all those things that claimed to do. And most historians will all tell you that that was an interpolation. Those were actually not the words of Josephus. The original Josephus has no mention of Christ anywhere in there. And actually Christian apologists wrote that and then inserted it into Josephus's text to explain, well, why was Jesus left out of Josephus's work? The answer is it wasn't. It's right there. But historians will tell you that's actually not what happened. Again, why did Jews reject Jesus? Or like, what about all the things that Jesus did? Well, it's a fair question. Who said that he actually did any of those things? Right now, it's still down to really one source, the New Testament, which really is going to be reduced to a handful of people. Are they telling the truth or are they not? The fourth source of the stories of the Jesus narrative is going to be found in the Talmud. Now, there are about a half dozen to a dozen references to Jesus in the Talmud. The Talmud, of course, being written right around this time, a few centuries after, but a lot of the stories in the Talmud are about events that took place. The Mishnahs wrote during this time. The Talmud is a few centuries later. A lot of the material contained in the Talmud, where there are historical accounts and things like that, do talk primarily about this time. And there are about a dozen, half dozen to a dozen references to Jesus in the Talmud. Now, none of them are flattering. They all talk about him as a heretic, and they all are very disparaging about Jesus. So again, why have Jews rejected Jesus? Well, that's going to be a part of it. The Talmud clearly speaks disparagingly or negatively, and not in glowing terms, about what he tried to do. They view him as a heretic. What's interesting is that the great Jewish scholars, going back all the way to times of the Rishonim, even Ramban himself, Moshe Nachmanides, Tosfos, I think, gets into it, they're not convinced. How do you say Jesus in Hebrew? Yehoshua, Joshua, but what do we? Yeshu, right? And there is this fellow who appears in several places in the Talmud as Yeshu HaNotzri, Yeshu the Nazarene. Right? That sounds like Jesus, right? And I guess in the collective Jewish memory, we have these different places and different references to Jesus in the Talmud. It's interesting, the scholars are not convinced. By scholars, I mean people like the early Rishonim. Ramban himself, who wrote a whole book or has a whole passage on this, is not convinced that this is Jesus. As a matter of fact, he makes a very cogent argument that the Yeshu HaNotzri, Yeshu, who's referred to in several places in the Talmud, cannot be referring to the same person. Because you'll see some of the stories that involve Yeshu with Rabbi Yeshua, his rabbi, Yeshua ben Prachia. Well, we know when Yeshua ben Prachia lived, and if you look at the other stories of Yeshu, he's associated with other rabbis. I can't remember offhand who they were, but we know historically those two rabbis did not live in the same generation. So he speculates all the Yeshu HaNotzris in the Talmud. He argues that there are actually three Jesuses. Now that sounds wild, but it's actually not so wild. How common is the name Yehoshua? That's a pretty common name. It's not an uncommon name, so it's very... Ramban, I don't think, is definitive about it, but his arguments are very cogent. Like, how do we explain this Yeshu in the Talmud appearing several different times with overlapping, with historical people who did not overlap? In Sefer HaGeula. The Ramban, Rabbi Moshe Nachmanides, I'll show you where it is. Ramban wrote a lot of the anti-polemical works against Christianity. We don't have time for it, but he was his famous debate that he had. He was forced to debate with Pablo Christianity in 1263 over the virtues of Judaism versus Christianity. He had to debate, was Jesus the Messiah or not? And number three, was the Messiah a divine origin? Of course, in Judaism, we believe that Judaism is right, Christianity is not. We don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and we also don't believe that the Messiah is of any divine origin. We believe the Messiah is a regular man of flesh and blood. So we get a lot of this information comes from Ramban. He then wrote over, it's called the Disputation of the Ramban. The Ramban had this argument. He then published his works, again, shortly thereafter, in 1265, something like that. So that's where a lot of this comes from. So it's in the Sefer HaGeula, as well as he wrote, the name of his book is called the Vikuach. I think it's in the Vikuach. I don't think it's in the Vikuach. I think it's in the Sefer HaGeula. But perhaps more fundamentally is if you look in source 5, even if Jesus, we are going to accept, which I don't, or from a historical perspective, even if Jesus did all these wonderful miracles, he walked on water, he turned the water into wine. What does that mean? What does that mean if someone does a miracle before your eyes? You know what that means? He can do something that you can't explain. That's all that means. Does that now mean I now need to listen to everything that he says? If you followed that rule in life, I think David Copperfield lives right over there. You're going to listen to whatever he says. The dude made the Statue of Liberty disappear. So he did something that I can't explain. That's a very poor way of giving someone credentials to live your entire life. If someone does something that you can't explain, what that means is they did something that you can't explain. That doesn't mean anything more than that. And as a matter of fact, Judaism, if you read in chapter 5, in source 5, the Jews did not believe in Moses, our teacher, because of the wonders that he performed. Judaism doesn't hinge on one guy doing a lot of miracles. Miracles just means he did something that I can't explain. Whenever anyone's belief is based on wonders, the commitment of his heart has shortcomings, because it is possible to perform a wonder through magic or sorcery. All the wonders performed by Moses in the desert were not intended to serve as proof of his prophecy, but rather were performed for a purpose. They needed the mun because they needed to eat, so God brought down the mun. They needed to split the sea, so they split the sea. We believe in Torah and Judaism not because of miracles, but because if you were at yesterday's Jewish Essential class, we believe in the divinity of the Torah. We believed in revelation at Sinai. We believed in God's communication. God appeared to 600,000 men, not including the women and children, about 2 to 3 million people. We believe in Judaism because of revelation, not because of miracles, because if someone does a miracle, that's all it means is he did something that you can't explain. So if you want to know why or how can Jews reject Christianity, what about all the things that Jesus did? So our answer is twofold. Number one, I question whether Jesus did those things. Based on what evidence, show me, internally, you tell me what evidence that I should look at that claims, that gives the veracity to the claims that Jesus did whatever you're telling me he did. It's really going to boil down to one guy who said that this is what he did. Okay. And number two, even if he did the things that you said that he did, all that means is he was able to do things that I can't explain. Okay. A lot of people do a lot of things that I can't explain. Which leads us to the final section. What about all of the verses in the Torah that are smoking gun references to Christ? What about all the verses in Tanakh, in the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, primarily the Nevi'im and Ksuvim, or in the Nevi'im, that talk about Jesus? So if you look, it's really on the last page of your handouts. If you ever had to deal with a missionary, they are going to quote there are a bunch of verses that they love to quote. Let's actually go back to source 8. It's on the second to last page. The favorite one that they're going to always quote is going to be Isaiah 53. They're going to quote a whole bunch of verses. Here's what we're going to do for the last 10 minutes, and we'll get you out of here on time. They're going to quote you verse after verse after this after that. And how do we respond to them? The answer to every verse that a Christian will quote to you as being smoking gun evidence to Jesus, I could tell you right now, they are not only they're not smoking gun evidence, they are all, without exception, very, very, very poor arguments. And you don't need to be a scholar. You just need to do 10 minutes worth of research to realize these are really, really bad claims. Every one of their claims, go through them case by case, got to go through every one of the claims that they say. It's right here in Isaiah 53. It's right here in Isaiah 7. Right here in Isaiah 9. Right here in Psalms 22. Right here in Jeremiah, I forget the source that they love, I think 11, that they love. You just look at the verse and actually read what the verse says. Really read it. Study it in the original Hebrew, not in the Christian Bible, but study it in the original Hebrew, and then try to see if that claim is a good claim. You will find, as what I have found, is that every one of the arguments that they make is going to fall very short based on one of 4 reasons. And I'm going to go through some examples. You will typically find that every one of their claims is going to have one of the following 4 problems. Most of the claims that they make actually will have several of these 4 problems, but I'm going to go through them one at a time. Isaiah 53 is probably the first thing that Christians love to quote. Not only that, I have a friend, he's a Christian minister, don't ask me why, he sends me all sorts of like these Hanukkah gifts and this and that. It was 2 years ago, he sent me a thing with a Hanukkah gift. He means well, very nice, a wonderful man. By the way, and I want to be very clear, I think most Christians today, even the pastors, I do think many, if not most, really do mean well. They're just ignorant. They're not, and as you're going to see all these misinterpretations, obvious misinterpretations. These are not devious, it's just they're misinformed. Most Christians can't read Hebrew. They've never studied the Bible in the original Hebrew, which they will tell you is the original source. It's not my Bible, it's their Bible. Like they believe in the Old Testament. They believe that it was written in Hebrew. They're ignorant, they've never read it. So they're uninformed. One of the things that they love to point to is Isaiah 53, but they also, because they think it's such a smoking gun proof to Jesus, they've now turned it into a scandal. He sent me this card, and they said, this is the chapter that the rabbis tried to expunge. They tried to delete it from the scripture. It's a scandal. Censorship. We've deleted Isaiah 53. And they put this, I'll prove it to you. They don't read it publicly. They don't read Isaiah 53 publicly. It's never read in the Torah. Scandal, right? That is the most, and he sent me this thing. And I called him up and I said, you do realize, of course, that the Haftorahs, which, yes, we do read the Torah publicly, and that we read the entire Torah, but we read less than 1% of the Nevi'im and Ksuvim publicly. It's very small sections. We actually do read Isaiah 54 and Isaiah 55, but there's a bulk of Isaiah is never read publicly. It's such a bad argument. It's such a distortion. It's such a lie. Like, there's like some scandal that we don't read Isaiah. We study Isaiah 53. Anyone wants to read Isaiah 53? It's right here in any Tanakh. Isaiah 53, it's right there. Why is it not read publicly? Well, first ask why 90% of the Tanakh is not read publicly. It's devious. That's what I told him. I said, it's a devious claim to make. You want to claim that Isaiah 53 is a smoking gun reference to Jesus? Fine, we'll go through that. But don't try to make this some kind of cover-up scandal. We don't read Isaiah. We study Isaiah 53 as much as I study any chapter in Tanakh. Isaiah 53 in source 8. Who would have believed our report, and from whom the arm of the Lord revealed? And he came up like a sapling before it, and like a root from the dry ground. He had neither form nor comeliness, and we saw him that he had no appearance. Now shall we desire him? Despised and rejected by man, a man of pains and accustomed to illness, and as one who hides his face from us, despised, and we held him of no account. Indeed, look at this verse. Indeed, he bore our illness, and our pains, he carries them. Yet we accounted him as plagued, smitten by God and oppressed. But he was pained because of our transgressions. Folks, Jesus died on the cross for you. The verse says it, right? And he was pained because of our transgressions. He was crushed because of our iniquities. The chastisement of our welfare was upon him, and with his wound we were healed. Jesus died for you, man. It says so in the Isaiah 53, right? Folks, here's problem number one. Here's problem number one with almost all of the arguments that Christians make. Who is Isaiah 53 talking about? It's definitely, they call it the suffering servant passages. There are actually 4 suffering servant passages in the Torah, in Isaiah. Who is that talking about? I'm going to tell you it's talking about me. Me. I've suffered. I've gone through a lot of difficulty. So maybe this is a prophetic vision about me, that I've suffered because of all of your sins. Can you disprove that? You can't. Argument number one, or fatal flaw number one, that almost all of these verses have, they quote some vague verse and they say, you see, it's Jesus. Look, it could be Jesus, it could be anyone. And it's talking about someone who suffered, and yes, the verse is telling us that someone suffered on behalf of someone else. Something like that. Who is that a reference to? So in Rabbinic Judaism, we have our tradition. This is talking about a collective, about the Jewish people in general throughout all the exiles. One of the reasons why we've suffered so much is on account of the rest of the world. What that means, good theological question, ayin sham, as they say. Go study the different interpretations. But whatever the Jewish response to what this verse is talking about, I would just say, just because it tells you that there's this suffering servant, aha, it's Jesus. Maybe it's Bob. Maybe it's Frank. How do you, it doesn't say doesn't tell us the social security number, doesn't tell us his mother's maiden name, gives no identification who this person is. So at best, I would call this vague. If you want more information, what exactly Isaiah 53 is, of course, the number one source to go, if anyone's interested, we don't have time to go through this in much detail, but if you want to really look into these things, I will point you in one direction. OutreachJudaism.com by Rabbi Tovia Singer. He is an expert in the New Testament and Old Testament. He knows Christianity better than the Pope. And he goes through these verses and he'll prove to you what these verses mean in much more in depth and detail. So if anyone is interested in learning, check that out. Let's look at problem number 2, which is going to be source 9, which is Tehillim Chaf Beis, Psalms 22. Be not far from me, for trouble is near me, for there is none to help. Many bulls have compassed me, strong bulls. This is the King James. You see on the left, this is the King James translation. Let's look at verse 16, is really where we want. For dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. They pierced whose hands and feet were pierced on the cross? Jesus Christ. And you see right here, Tehillim makes a direct reference to Jesus. case closed, right? My little son, Benny Meth, is a smart kid. He's a smart kid. But even I know I'm biased. I know he's not the most brilliant kid in the world. He's a good kid. I showed him this verse, Pasuk Yud Zayin in the Hebrew, and I asked him, I said, Benny, no agendas, I'm not telling you, don't ask me why I'm asking you. This was last night. I said, Benny, I want you to translate this. He's 13 years old. 13 years old. I asked him, translate this verse for me. Ki sivavuni kilavim. He got that. Sivavuni is a hard word. He said, for dogs surround me. Adas mireim. He said, a congregation of something. Mireim means evildoers. Hekifuni. I said, hakafa. Hakafa means to enclose. So these, okay. Now read the last three words. I said, Benny, this is what I want to know. Ka'ari yodai viraglai. Ka'ari. Any Hebrew speakers here? Ka'ari. Like a lion. How does the King James translate that? They pierced my hands. Folks, you need to be a 13-year-old whose second language is Hebrew to know that is a blatant mistranslation. So they're like, smoking gun, Jesus Christ, Tehillim Chaf Beis. They totally mistranslated a word. Ka'ari. Well, Rabbi, how do you know that that's what that word means? Maybe it also means they pierced me. If you look 5 verses earlier, it uses the word aryeh, ari. Internally, the King James Bible translates that word as a lion. They have a theory. This is a great theory. They say, no. The word, it's a misspelling. Really, the word is ka'aru. Ka'aru. It's a vav or a yud, and it's really supposed to be ka'aru. Now, ka'aru doesn't even mean pierced. Ka'aru means uncovering a pit, maybe. Also, it would be misspelled. And most importantly, this is my favorite one, they have a copy of Tehillim uncovered. Remember, we referenced the Qumran caves. Now, the Qumran caves, that sect, those scrolls predate Jesus. It says Ka'ari. It's amazing. I love that one. Isaiah 9. So we have either the verbs. Sometimes these verses that they show at us are totally vague. I don't know who you're talking about. Number 2, a total complete translation. And then we get the third problem. Let's look at source number 10, Isaiah 9. Ki yelad yulad lanu, ben nitan lanu, vati ha-misra al shechma, v'yikari shmo pela yoetz, el gibor, aviyad, sar shalom, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and he shall counsel, and his name shall be called the Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Who is the Prince of Peace, everyone? Jesus Christ, right here, Isaiah 9. You can't argue with it, right? Everyone, by the way, in the Christian Bible, this will be Isaiah, this will be not verse 5, it's verse 6. It's just they have a different way of slicing up the verses, but it's the same psukim. The third problem that Christians all make whenever they look at these smoking gun verses, I say, okay, terrific. What was the previous verse? What was the verse after it? What was 2 verses before? They can quote Isaiah 53. Did anyone quote Isaiah 52? Do you know what Isaiah 52 says? It's so hard to, you read one verse and you say, here it is. You have no context for that. You're taking one verse totally out of context. If you read Isaiah 9, and the verses beforehand and the verses afterhand, it's a clear reference to a completely different story. It has nothing to do with it. The story this is the story. Isaiah 9 is the story. It's a prophecy where Isaiah is talking to King Ahaz and telling him, I'm telling you what's going to happen in coming years. It's actually decades away. I want you to know that in coming years, Sancherib, who's the Assyrian king, is going to drive away the northern kingdom of the Jewish people. But don't worry, he's not going to drive away from you. He's not going to drive the southern kingdom. Judea will stay. Judea will say, it's clearly what the verse says. That's what the context is. And he says, as a way of proving it to you, there is a son of Ki ben Yulad Lanu, Ben Nitan Lanu, and it's a reference to his son who's being King Hezekiah, King Chizkiyahu, who was called these things. It's clear from the verses, if you just bother reading the verse beforehand, the verses afterhand, this is not talking about something in the distant future 700 years away. It's talking about something that was happening right then, the birth of King Hezekiah. That's problem number 3. And then problem number 4 is probably the most egregious. If we look at source 11, this is from Isaiah 7. It's one of the favorite verses that they will ever quote. This is probably the Christian's most favorite verse. God will give to you a sign. Let's read the King James. Therefore, the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son and shall call his name Emmanuel. Virgin birth, what's that a reference to? Mary giving birth to Jesus Christ, right? This verse happens to have all four problems the first problem is it's vague. Okay, we're going to accept your translation, everything about it. It doesn't give Jesus his social security number. This could be talking about anyone. I don't know. Who's this talking about? Okay. Number two, probably the most egregious thing about this verse, is it's a blatant mistranslation. An egregious mistranslation. Anyone who speaks Hebrew, how do you say virgin in Hebrew? Betulah. Oh, but rabbis don't talk about that kind of thing. Do you know how many times the word betulah comes up in the Torah? Like 1,000,000 times. The Torah's not bashful. If it needs to say virgin, it says virgin. The word here is ha'alma. Ha'alma means something very specific. A young girl. It's not virgin ever. The King James Bible will translate, so it'll tell you internally the word for virgin is betulah, not alma. So this is an internal mistranslation, number two. Number three, again, context. They've one verse. This verse is clearly, again, not talking about something that's happening 700 years later. What's happening is this is a verse where where Isaiah, again, to King Achav, is telling Achav, who is terrified that he's under attack, that there is right now Achav is an evil king. Achav was a terrible king, and there was an alliance between the northern kingdom, Pekach ben Remaliahu, as well, and with Mitzrayim, with Egypt, and they were Israel was in a pincer against those two. Judea was in a pincer against them, and Isaiah is telling the king Achav, you have nothing to worry about. God, even though you're an evil, rotten person, God will save you, and I'll prove to you a sign that that's true, because there will be this birth. Someone is going to give birth to a child. Kras Shmo Immanuel. His name will be Emmanuel, and that will be a sign that you're going to be delivered. Now, if this is a reference to something 700 years later, how exactly is that a sign to Achav, who's being attacked in this pincer moment right now? If it's in context, it makes no sense. It can't be referring to the Christian birth to Christ, which isn't for almost a millennium later. But that's not the most egregious thing. The most egregious thing is number four. It's a blatant, this is where they actually delete the text. There's an actual deletion of the text. The verse says, L'chein yitein Hashem hu lachem os. God shall give you a sign. Ha-alma. What does ha-alma mean? The. Look how they translate it. A virgin shall conceive. There's a big difference between the virgin and a virgin. A virgin means someone distant. There's a virgin somewhere. If I say ha-alma, and I'm Isaiah, and I'm talking to Achav, and I tell him the virgin, he obviously knows exactly who I'm talking to. And according to Jewish tradition, it's a reference to Isaiah's wife, who is going to give, who is to say a daughter or something. It's a matter of dispute. That, and by the way, it wasn't a virgin; it was a young girl, right? That the young girl, who they knew what was going on, is going to conceive. And the miracle, according to different opinions, what the miracle is despite her not hearing this conversation, she is going to name the child Emmanuel, even though you didn't know. That's one explanation. There might be other explanations what the miracle was. But it's not a virgin or a young woman, it's the young woman, because it's not a reference to something distant in the future, it's a clear reference to something right now. Another clear deletion. It says, Vikaras Shemo Immanuel. What is Vikaras? For those who know Hebrew, how do you precisely translate Vikaras? Vikarat. And who will call? Vikarat?
It's female.
Female. Right. Means, and she will call. It's going back on this Alma. This Alma who was just identified, she will call. How does the Christian Bible translate it? And it's in King James, and shall call his name. Or it's like this identity. Right? That's not what the word says. The word says, and she shall call. Why did they change all of that? Because if you read the verse carefully, it's clearly a reference to someone that they knew, presumably Isaiah's wife, that she will have a baby, and she will name the child Emmanuel. But they want this to be referenced to something 700 years later. So they deliberately deleted and altered the Torah, the Tanakh.
How do you get Yeshu from Emmanuel?
Maybe there was another name, a nickname. So you want to know what we do with the New Testament, or all these claims that the Old Testament has clear references to Jesus? Don't trust me. Don't trust me. Look up any of these claims. They are all, I don't mean this disrespectfully, but it's hogwash. It's baloney. I don't think the people that push this stuff forward are evil. They just don't know any better. They just were taught this by some guy. Some guy started it was evil and it was done deliberately, but most Christians are just completely ignorant to all of this. I want to end with one story. Can I end with one story? I went way late. I'm sorry. One quick story and then we'll call it a day. And it's a story that Rabbi Tovia Singer teaches over. It's one of my favorite stories. A person might think, okay, I need to go through, the New Testament. We need to study Christianity. We want to know why do Jews reject Christianity. We need to study Christianity really, really well to really understand. Study the New Testament, study Christianity, and know it backwards and forwards, right? He tells over an amazing story. He said he once bumped into a Secret Service agent. Now, everyone knows this is right. We all know the Secret Service, their job is to protect the president. Another thing the Secret Service does is they are the agency in the federal government whose job is to check for counterfeit money, right? Their job is to weed out counterfeit money. And he bumped into an officer who works for the Secret Service and asked her, he said, she actually trains people, Secret Service agents, to detect counterfeit bills. And Rabbi Singer says she went over to this lady and said, you probably spend like years of training looking at all sorts of counterfeit techniques and counterfeit dollars and all the machines and printing presses. You know how to counterfeit money, right? If you want to detect counterfeit dollars, you must know counterfeiting really, really, really well, right? She said, no, I don't know counterfeiting at all. And that's not what we teach. You know what we do? We spend 6 months studying the real thing. We look at real crisp $20 bills. On the most, deep of levels. We study it, we taste it, we smell it, we look at the real thing under the microscope. When you study the real thing really well, you can very quickly tell that's not the real thing. I don't know what it is. You don't need to study the fake thing to know what's fake. Study the real thing. And when you have a real firm grasp of what a good, clean, kosher $20 bill is, you'll know when something isn't. Folks, you don't need to study Christianity. If you want, go for it. You don't need to explore it. I would encourage, study the real thing. You don't need this. This is unnecessary. You need this. Study the real Torah. Study it. Observe it. Really, really, really study it. And it'll be so self-apparent why this thing is rejected by Jews. I'm going to thank you all for coming. I apologize I went over. And if anyone has any questions, I'm here to stick around. But of course, feel free to eat more and drink more coffee. Thank you.